Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be exploring something a little different.
Oh,
A collection of short stories by Eliza Clark
great.
called She's Always Hungry. Now, fair warning, these stories, they're not your average light read. They're a mix of horror, satire, and this really dark humor that kind of makes you laugh and cringe. At the same time,
Yeah, I can see that.
there's even a content note mentioning potentially disturbing themes.
Oh, wow.
So buckle up. I dove into this collection, and honestly, it's left me with more questions than answers.
Interesting. What I think is so fascinating about Clark's work is how she takes these seemingly outlandish situations and uses them to explore
Huh.
seriously deep-seated anxieties about our culture. It's
Ooh.
like she's holding up this distorted mirror
Huh.
to our modern world.
Yeah.
And what we see reflecting back at us is both hilarious and terrifying.
Okay, so let's start with the first story. Build a body like mine. Have you ever heard of a weight loss program involving parasitic worms?
God, no.
Yeah, me neither. But that's the bizarre premise of this story. That's wild. So right from the start, we're thrown into this world where the desire to achieve the perfect body completely overrides common sense, even basic health concerns.
It's crazy.
It really makes you think about the lengths people go to, especially women, to conform to these often unattainable beauty standards.
Exactly. And the protagonist's journey is wild. She becomes absolutely obsessed
Mm.
with food and her body image.
Yeah.
And the things she does to lose weight are, well, extreme, to say the least.
Oh, yeah.
Even when it starts affecting her health, she keeps pushing further and further.
Wow.
And she's hiding all of this from her partner, Shadi, who's obviously worried sick.
Yeah.
I mean, how many of us have felt that pressure to look a certain way?
Oh, yeah.
I know I've fallen into those comparison traps scrolling through social media.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how much those algorithms and influencer culture feed into our own anxieties.
That's a good point. That secrecy and Shadi's concern really highlight the isolation and shame that often surround eating disorders. This isn't just about a physical transformation, it's a psychological one, too.
The worms almost become this symbol of how insidious societal pressures can be, burrowing their way into our minds and distorting how we see ourselves.
It's almost like those clickbait articles you see sometimes. Lose 10 pounds in 3 days.
Oh, yeah.
We all know it's too good to be true, but there's a part of us that wants to believe it anyway.
Totally.
It's scary how easily we can fall prey to those promises, even when they come at a high cost. And then there's the humor woven throughout the story. There's this one scene where she's describing her food cravings, and it's written in this incredibly vivid, almost erotic way.
Really?
It's disturbing, but also strangely funny.
Interesting. That dark humor is so crucial to Clark's style. It makes these heavy themes more digestible. But it also forces us to confront the unsettling truths beneath the surface.
Yeah.
It's like she's saying, look, this is messed up. But we can laugh at it too, because that's how we cope.
Yeah, it's like a defense mechanism, right?
Yeah.
But it also makes you think, what does this all mean? For us as readers, does achieving the perfect body ever really justify the sacrifices we make?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it also raises a point about the power of societal norms and how they can warp our self-perception. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked desire, especially when the ideal we're chasing might be inherently harmful.
Speaking of chasing things that may not be what they seem, let's move on to The Shadow over Little Chitaly.
Okay.
This one takes us into this weird world of online reviews and a mysterious takeaway restaurant that seems to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time.
What? Clark's use of online reviews to tell the story is brilliant. We get these fragmented glimpses of people's experiences, often conflicting, which just adds to the mystery and the feeling of disorientation. It's like trying to piece together a puzzle where half the pieces are missing.
And the experiences these customers describe are hilarious. Imagine ordering a Hawaiian pizza and getting one with apple instead of pineapple, or
What?
thinking you're getting Chinese food, and ending up with an entire Indian meal.
That's
It's like this bizarre culinary roulette where you never know what you're going to get. I mean, who hasn't had a food delivery mishap?
Oh yeah, all the time.
But this is next level.
For sure. The humor definitely comes from that incongruity. But there's also this underlying sense of unease.
Like what?
Like, why is the driver acting so strangely? And what's with that warehouse they discover at the end?
Right.
It all points to something darker lurking beneath the surface of this seemingly absurd situation. It makes you wonder if maybe there's a method to the madness.
Right. Like, is someone intentionally messing with these customers, or is it something more supernatural at play? It definitely leaves you wanting more, even if you're not sure you want to know the answer.
I can see that.
And this idea of projecting our own desires onto others, which
No.
we were just talking about, plays a huge role in the next story, Goth GF.
Okay.
This one's about a guy who becomes completely infatuated with Willow, a goth girl he works with.
Hmm.
But is it real attraction, or is it something else entirely?
That's the core question, isn't it? Clark plays with this idea of the manic pixie dream girl trope. That quirky, mysterious female character
Mhm.
who exists solely to teach the male protagonist some life lessons.
Oh, yeah.
But in this case, she flips the script a bit, making us question the motivations of both characters.
Their personalities are like night and day. He's awkward and eager to please, while she's blunt and seems to dislike pretty much everyone.
Oh.
But the more he learns about her, especially through her Instagram, the more obsessed he becomes.
Interesting.
It makes you think about how social media can create these curated versions of ourselves, which can be really misleading.
Absolutely. It's like we're constantly bombarded with these picture-perfect versions of people's lives, and it's easy to forget that there's a real person behind those filtered photos.
Right.
It just raises this important question. Is his attraction genuine? Or is he just projecting his own desires onto this seemingly unattainable figure?
It's a commentary on how we can idealize people, especially through the lens of social media. And he goes to some pretty crazy lengths to impress her, even getting a tattoo and pushing his own boundaries. But she remains largely indifferent. The ending is ambiguous, leaving you wondering if he ever really understood her at all.
It sounds like he was so caught up in the idea of her
Yeah.
that he missed the real person entirely.
Yeah.
That unsettling feeling comes from the protagonist's lack of self-awareness. He's so focused on winning Willow's approval that he fails to see her as a complex individual.
Right.
With her own agency, which
Right.
makes you think, is he really interested in her? Or just the idea of her?
Okay, so if you thought the last story was a bit creepy, get ready for Shakewell.
Okay.
Because this one takes body horror to a whole new level. Poppy, a teenager who's super insecure about her acne, tries this treatment that has some seriously messed up side effects.
Oh no. Clark's stories often dive into this dark side of beauty standards, and this one is particularly intense. It's a commentary on the pressure young women face to conform and how those pressures can lead them to make dangerous choices.
Yeah.
I mean, we've all seen those ads for miracle products that promise to fix all our flaws. But what are we really willing to sacrifice for that supposed perfection?
Right, and Poppy's physical transformation is straight out of a nightmare. Her new skin is described as this flawless porcelain, but it's also mask-like, almost artificial.
Wow.
And then there's this crack that appears on her forehead, which is both grotesque and strangely fascinating.
I can see that.
It's like her body is rebelling against this forced transformation, and it makes you wonder if maybe those imperfections are what make us human in the first place.
That imagery of the crack is powerful. It subtilizes the breaking point. The moment when her pursuit of perfection leads to her literal fragmentation.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder that beauty can be a double-edged sword, and that sometimes what we perceive as flaws are actually what make us unique.
And the ambiguous ending, like in many of Clark's stories, leaves you with this unsettling feeling. Did she actually achieve what she wanted? Or did she become something monstrous in the process?
I don't know.
It's like a cautionary tale about the dangers of quick fixes and the idea that beauty can be skin deep.
That ambiguity is deliberate. It forces us to confront the question of what we're willing to sacrifice in the name of beauty, and whether those sacrifices are truly worth it. And it challenges us to examine our own perceptions of beauty and whether they're based on external pressures or our own internal values.
And now for something completely different. We arrive at the king. This story drops us into a post-apocalyptic world, ruled by this immortal being who happens to be a huge Elvis fan.
What?
Yeah, you heard that right, Elvis.
Elvis.
In the apocalypse.
Okay. It's amazing how Clark can blend humor with these really dark themes.
Yeah.
The king is this fascinating character study in power dynamics and how easily someone can slip into tyranny, even with seemingly good intentions. And the humor isn't just there for laughs. It makes the story even more unsettling because it makes you question everything you're seeing.
The king's voice is unforgettable. This mix of self-awareness, cynicism, and dark humor. It's like they know they're a caricature, but they lean into it completely. And their reunion with Shauna, another immortal being, creates this clash of ideologies that's both tense and thought-provoking. It's like they represent two sides of the same coin, two different ways to survive and lead in a world that's gone completely mad.
Exactly. The king embraces their power, ruling with an iron fist. While Shauna questions the morality of their choices, it makes you think about the compromises we might make in extreme situations and whether those compromises are ultimately worth it.
One quote that really sums up the king's attitude is, "Ultimately, I'm rebuilding things as they should be, with us at the top, you know?"
Wow.
It's chilling, but also kind of funny in its bluntness. It's like, yeah, they're a tyrant, but at least they're honest about it.
That quote captures the essence of the story's unsettling blend of humor and horror. It forces us to confront the seductive nature of power and the dangers of unchecked ambition, even when the world is crumbling around us.
These are just a few of the incredible ideas Eliza Clark explores in She's Always Hungry. Her stories are unsettling, for sure, but they also leave you thinking, long after you finish reading them. It's like she's planted these seeds of doubt and questioning in your mind, and they just keep growing.
What I find so fascinating is how she combines these weighty themes with dark humor and bizarre scenarios. It's a unique blend that makes the stories both disturbing and strangely engaging. And the characters are so flawed and complex
Yeah.
that you can't help but feel drawn to them. Even when they're making questionable choices, it's like she's holding up a mirror to humanity, warts and all.
Totally. They make you think about societal pressures,
Mm.
body image, and the choices we make when we're chasing our desires.
Hmm.
It makes me wonder, what stood out to you as the most prominent theme running through all of these stories?
If I had to pick one, I'd say it's the exploration of desire in all its forms. The desire for acceptance, control, beauty, and power. Clark delves into the complexities of these desires and how they can both drive us and ultimately consume us. It's like a double-edged sword, right?
Right.
Desire can be a powerful motivator, but it can also lead us down some pretty dark paths.
That's such a great point, and it leads me to my next question. If you could ask Eliza Clark one question about these stories, what would it be?
That's a tough one. I think I'd ask her about her process for creating these unsettling atmospheres. How does she build that tension and dread that permeates her work? Because it's truly masterful, and I'd love to get a glimpse into her creative mind.
That's a fantastic question, and I'm sure our listeners have a million questions of their own. After diving into these strange and unsettling tales.
Speaking of unsettling, the next story we're going to delve into, She's Always Hungry, might be the most unsettling of them all. It takes us to this isolated fishing village where the men are literally driven mad by hunger and the women are forced to make some truly difficult choices to survive.
And when you say difficult, you mean?
Let's just say this story will stay with you long after you finish listening. It's a dark and disturbing exploration of the primal instincts that can emerge when people are pushed to the brink of survival.
Well, I'm officially intrigued, and I'm sure our listeners are too, but we'll have to save that discussion for the next part of our deep dive.
Stay tuned, because things are about to get really interesting. So remember how we were just talking about those unsettling undercurrents in Little Chitaly?
Yeah.
She's always hungry, takes
Yeah.
that feeling, and cranks it up to 11. This story is like a punch to the gut.
You weren't kidding about it being intense. This one really got under my skin. I felt like I needed a shower after reading it.
Oh, wow.
The whole atmosphere of this isolated fishing village is so oppressive. And then you have this creeping sense of dread that just builds and builds.
Clark has this amazing ability to create these claustrophobic worlds where the boundaries between reality and nightmare start to blur.
It's scary.
It's like something ancient and primal is lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to erupt.
And it does erupt in a way that's both horrifying and strangely poetic.
It really is.
It all starts with this disturbing scene at the local pub, right? Our Mary Samuel, this young guy from the village, stabs another man after being taunted.
Oh, geez.
But it quickly becomes clear that this isn't just a random act of violence. It's connected to something much bigger and more sinister, something the villagers call the spread.
Right, that stabbing becomes a catalyst. It's like a crack in the facade of this seemingly tight-knit community.
Yeah.
And it exposes the fear and desperation that's simmering beneath the surface.
I see.
We see how easily their traditions and beliefs can be twisted into something harmful, even deadly.
And the way the women, led by the village elders, take these drastic actions to try to contain the spread, it's also secretive and ritualistic. It feels like they're trying to appease some ancient force. But we never really know what that force is or where it comes from. It's like they're performing these rituals out of blind faith, hoping to ward off the inevitable.
That secrecy really speaks to the power of tradition and the fear of the unknown. These women are caught in this web of ancient customs, and they're willing to make unimaginable sacrifices to maintain order, even if it means sacrificing their own humanity.
And then we have John, who stumbles upon this bizarre creature that doesn't seem to belong to any known species. It's described in such vivid detail, but at the same time, it's so otherworldly that you can't even picture it.
Right.
He hides it away, and
Yeah.
as it changes and evolves, so does John.
Interesting.
It's like this dark, symbiotic relationship that begins to consume him.
That creature becomes this embodiment of the other, the thing that doesn't fit into their rigid worldview. And as John becomes more and more entangled with it, the lines between human and monstrous begin to blur. It's a fascinating exploration of identity and how easily our own sense of self can be corrupted.
The ending, oh my God, the ending. It's brutal and relentless.
Yeah.
The men, driven mad by their insatiable hunger, become these savage beasts.
Oh, jeez.
And many of the women, compelled by some unknown force, flee into the sea, embracing their fate. John is left behind, surrounded by those older women who seem to be immune to the spread, their faces weathered and ancient. It's a haunting image that just stays with you.
It's like a scene out of a nightmare.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it has this strange beauty to it. It's a world where survival comes at a terrible cost, and the boundaries between victim and perpetrator become completely blurred. Clark doesn't offer any easy answers, which makes the story all the more powerful.
It definitely makes you think about the limits of human endurance and the lengths we might go to in order to survive. And it's interesting how she's always hungry ties back to some of the themes we saw in Build a Body Like Mine.
Right.
The body as a site of both horror and fascination. The idea of transformation and the consequences of unchecked desires.
Yes, there are definitely some recurring motifs across these stories that we'll want to touch on later. But now let's shift gears and dive into Extinction Event.
Okay.
This story takes us into the realm of science fiction, but with a very real-world anxiety at its core, the climate crisis.
This one felt eerily relevant, considering everything that's happening in the world right now. It's about Dr. Babalola, a scientist who specializes in cacti. But she's kidnapped and brought to this secret facility called Lazarus Base. And they're not exactly interested in her expertise on desert plants.
Right, they have something much bigger in mind. For Dr. Babalola, they believe she holds the key to saving the planet from environmental disaster.
And that key comes in the form of these strange alien life forms they call objects.
I mean, cacti are cool and all, but this is next level stuff.
Yeah.
These objects are supposed to be the solution to climate change. But something feels off from the beginning. Dr. Babalola senses it. And as a reader, I felt it too. There's this underlying tension, like something sinister is lurking beneath the surface of this supposed salvation.
That tension is key to the story's effectiveness. On the one hand, you have this glimmer of hope, a potential solution to this global crisis that's threatening to destroy everything.
Right.
But on the other hand, there's this growing sense of unease, this feeling that something isn't right about these objects, about the people who control them.
It's like the classic too good to be true scenario, right?
Yeah.
And Dr. Babalola, as she digs deeper, starts to uncover these unsettling truths about the objects. They're far more complex and potentially dangerous than anyone initially realized.
And this raises some huge ethical questions.
Yeah.
About manipulating nature, about the hubris of playing God, and the potential for unintended consequences.
It's like Clark is asking, how far are we willing to go to save ourselves, and at what cost?
There's this one scene where Dr. Babalola is watching the news, and they're hailing the objects as saviors, these miracle workers, that are going to cleanse the planet.
Wow.
But she knows something the rest of the world doesn't. She knows the dark truth about these objects and the threat they pose. It's a chilling moment that really highlights the disconnect between perception and reality.
That scene speaks volumes about the power of propaganda and the way information can be controlled and manipulated, even in the face of a global crisis. It's a reminder that even with the best intentions, things can go horribly wrong, especially when those in power are driven by their own agendas.
It's like she's Cassandra, cursed with knowledge that no one will believe. And the story ends on this incredibly bleak note. Dr. Babalola, locked out of her lab, can only watch as the objects continue to spread across the globe. Knowing that something catastrophic is about to happen, it's a powerful ending that leaves you with this sense of impending doom.
It's a reminder that knowledge doesn't always equal power, even when faced with undeniable evidence. Those in control may choose to ignore the truth. if it threatens their authority, or their carefully constructed narratives. And sometimes, the most terrifying monsters aren't lurking in the shadows. They're created in labs by people who believe they're doing the right thing.
It's a sobering thought, for sure, and it makes you wonder about the limits of scientific ambition and the dangers of playing God with nature.
Yeah, it really does.
So from the end of the world to the complexities of teenage angst, Night Stalkers takes us to Santa Carla, California,
Right.
a setting familiar to any fan of 80s vampire flicks. But this isn't your typical bloodsucker tale.
Right.
It's a coming-of-age story about Keith, a teenager who's torn between his loyalty to his best friend Tommy and his own desires.
This story felt very grounded. Despite the fantastical elements, it captures that awkwardness and confusion of adolescence, the shifting allegiances, the exploration of identity, and the intense need to belong. It's like we're all back in high school, trying to figure out who we are and where we fit in.
Keith and Tommy are like your typical teenage boys, hanging out at the beach, getting high, breaking into houses for kicks. But there's this underlying tension in their relationship,
But what?
a sense of competition that goes beyond just a friendly rivalry. It's almost like they're both vying for the same spot.
In the social hierarchy?
Their dynamic is really fascinating. It's like Clark is dissecting the complexities of male friendship, particularly during those formative years.
Yeah.
There's a sense of wanting to be seen, to be validated. And sometimes that desire for validation can lead to some pretty destructive behaviors.
And Tommy is completely obsessed with girls, constantly trying to hook up with anyone he can find.
Oh, jeez.
Keith goes along with it, but you can sense that he's starting to realize that his own desires might not be the same as Tommy's. That tension between following the crowd and forging your own path is a major theme in this story. Keith's caught between wanting to please Tommy and stay in his good graces and this growing awareness of his own individual needs and desires. It's a struggle that I think a lot of people can relate to, especially during those turbulent teenage years.
And then things take this weird turn. When they drop acid with Tommy's latest conquest, this girl named Rainbow, the whole night spirals out of control. And Keith ends up wandering off on his own, drawn to this affluent neighborhood called Playa Dorada. It's like he's stepping into a different world, a world that represents everything he desires, but can't attain.
That journey to Playa Dorada is symbolic. It's about transgression, about pushing boundaries, both physically and emotionally. Keith is breaking free from the constraints of his friendship with Tommy and exploring these darker impulses that he's been trying to suppress.
And he breaks into a house, not to steal anything, but just to experience this forbidden space. It's such a vulnerable moment, but also reckless and kind of dangerous.
That act of breaking in becomes a metaphor for Keith's internal struggle. He's breaking free from the mold that Tommy's tried to fit him into, and he's exploring these hidden facets of himself, even if they scare him.
And when he finally reunites with Tommy, there's this confrontation, both physical and emotional, that just explodes all over the page. It's raw, it's unsettling, and it leaves you questioning the future of their friendship. It's like they've reached a point of no return, and there's no going back to the way things were.
That confrontation is the culmination of all the tension that's been building throughout the story. It's a moment of truth, where both boys are forced to face their own desires and the consequences of their actions, and raises the question of whether some friendships are meant to run their course, even if it's painful.
Night Stalkers is a powerful exploration of adolescent angst and the complexities of desire. It's a story that stays with you long after you've finished reading it.
It's a reminder that the path to self-discovery can be messy and full of uncertainty, especially during those tumultuous teenage years. Clark captures those feelings of unease, longing, and the need to break free with a rawness that's both captivating and disturbing.
So we've got Shakewell and the King left to unpack. Shakewell brings us back to those anxieties around beauty standards, which we saw play out in Build a Body Like Mine, but with even more visceral detail.
This one is a tough read, but in a good way. It pushes you to confront some uncomfortable truths about our obsession with youth and physical perfection. It's like holding a magnifying glass up to those insecurities that we all try to hide.
I'm ready to dive back in, but I think our listeners might need a moment to process everything we've discussed so far. These stories really pack a punch.
Let's pick up with Shakewell in the next part of our deep dive. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.
All right, let's dive back into She's Always Hungry and pick up with Shakewell,
Okay.
which we were saying is a pretty tough one.
Yeah, it really gets under your skin.
Yeah.
It makes you question all those messages about beauty and perfection.
Yeah, we were talking about how it revisits those themes
Hmm.
of body horror and the pressure women face to conform, which we saw in Build a Body Like Mine.
Right.
But this one seems even more intense.
Absolutely. It's like Clark takes those anxieties and magnifies them, showing us just how far people will go for acceptance and validation.
Right from the start, we're introduced to Poppy, who's so obsessed with clearing her acne that she's willing to try this experimental treatment.
Uh-oh.
That seems pretty sketchy.
Yeah.
And the side effects are just wild. I mean, she gets this flawless porcelain skin, but it's described as mask-like, almost artificial.
That's creepy.
And then there's this crack that appears on her forehead. It's like her body's literally breaking down under the strain of this forced transformation.
That crack is such a powerful image. It's like a physical manifestation of the damage she's inflicting on herself. This pursuit of perfection, especially when it's driven by external pressures, can really lead to a fragmentation of the self.
It's so unsettling how Poppy seems almost oblivious to the horror of it all.
Right.
She's so excited about her new skin, about how people react to her, and she even gives away all her makeup as if she no longer needs it.
Oh, wow.
It's both sad and kind of creepy.
Her detachment from reality speaks to the power of denial and how we can blind ourselves to the truth when it's too painful to face.
Yeah.
She's so focused on achieving that flawless exterior that she ignores the internal damage, the loss of herself.
And the ending is ambiguous. Like so many of Clark's stories, we see Poppy leaving Kyle, seemingly empowered by her transformation. But is she really in control? Or has she become a prisoner of this new monstrous beauty?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It forces us to confront whether Poppy has actually achieved anything, or if she's simply traded one prison for another.
It's like a modern-day fairy tale gone wrong, where the quest for beauty leads to this twisted transformation. It
Yeah.
makes you wonder, how do we define beauty? And who gets to decide what's beautiful and what's not?
Those are questions we all have to grapple with, especially in a world where we're constantly bombarded with images of so-called perfection.
Right.
And Clark's story is a reminder that those images, they're often manufactured, airbrushed, ultimately unattainable.
Okay, we've talked about body horror, societal pressures, and the climate crisis. Now get ready for The King, which is set in a post-apocalyptic world, ruled by an Elvis-obsessed immortal being.
I'm intrigued.
I know, it sounds wild. But Clark's ability to blend humor and horror is really on full display here. And it makes you think about the nature of power and how easily someone can slip into tyranny, even with seemingly good intentions.
That's a good point.
I was immediately drawn to the King's voice, that mix of self-awareness and cynicism and this really dark sense of humor.
Yeah, I like that.
They know they're a caricature, but they fully embrace it. It's like they're saying, yeah, I'm the ruler of this wasteland, and I'm going to do it my way.
It makes him such a fascinating character study, this bundle of contradictions, capable of great kindness and incredible cruelty, sometimes in the same breath.
And their obsession with Elvis adds this layer of absurdity that makes their ruthlessness even more unsettling.
They see that.
And their reunion with Shauna, another immortal being, is electric.
Wow.
They have this ideological clash that highlights the different approaches to survival and leadership in a world gone mad. It's like they represent two different paths, two different philosophies for navigating this new reality.
It's a clash between pragmatism and idealism, between order and chaos. The King prioritizes control and stability, while Shauna holds on to a sense of morality, even in the face of societal collapse.
It really makes you think, in a world without rules, what principles would you cling to?
That's a tough one.
One quote that really sums up the King's attitude is, "The meek will inherit the earth. Don't think so. The peak will inherit, that's me." So arrogant and over the top, but also hilarious in its bluntness. Like, they're taking that classic Elvis swagger and amplifying it to an apocalyptic level.
That quote encapsulates their whole worldview. They believe they're at the pinnacle of evolution, the rightful ruler of this wasteland, and they're not afraid to let everyone know it.
In the ending, oh man, the ending.
What happened?
It's both tragic and hilarious. The King, betrayed by Shauna, who's become the very tyrant they once were, gets a taste of their own medicine.
Oh, wow.
The cyclical turn of events suggests that power corrupts, no matter who wields it.
It's a commentary on human nature. Even in the face of an apocalypse, we seem destined to repeat the same mistakes, driven by our desire for power and control.
It's a sobering thought, but it also speaks to the resilience of the human spirit, our ability to adapt and rebuild, even in the most challenging circumstances.
So she's always hungry, It's more than just a collection of short stories.
It's a wild ride through the darkest corners of human nature, this distorted mirror reflecting our anxieties and desires. It's unsettling, thought-provoking, and often darkly funny,
Yeah.
leaving you with a lingering sense of unease
Yeah.
and a whole lot to think about.
What I think is most impressive is how Clark blends those disturbing elements with really sharp social commentary, making us question our assumptions about beauty, desire, and the choices we make, in a world that often feels like it's teetering on the edge of chaos.
So after diving deep into these stories, what would you say is the takeaway for our listeners?
Embrace the discomfort. Let these stories challenge your perceptions, make you question your own desires, and leave you with that lingering sense of unease. Because sometimes, the most unsettling stories are the ones that hold up a mirror to our own humanity, forcing us to confront those uncomfortable truths that we often try to ignore.
That's a great way to put it. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. What if these fictional worlds aren't as far-fetched as we think? What if the monsters lurking in the shadows are simply reflections of ourselves?
It's a question worth pondering. After all, the most terrifying monsters are often the ones we create ourselves.